screen as a panelist, Carney. You won't need to be co-host.
Well, I already made him co-host, and now I made Autumn host, so I can't take away his power.
That was a mistake.
I know.
They try all the time. They're trying all the time.
Oh, somebody's got to keep everybody else here in check. And
very good.
Welcome everybody. It is so exciting to be with all of you this week before Passover as Pesach approaches. I'm sure everybody here has nothing else to be doing right now, but hopefully you've taken a break from whatever it is that is keeping you busy, and we're just thrilled to get to spend, hopefully you're having some lunch or something else to spend this time with you. So I am Maharat Rory Picker-Niece. I'm the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council, and joined by Rabbi Jim Bennett from Congregation Sher Emeth, and Rabbi Carney Rose from Congregation B'nai Emunah, and Rabbi Daniel Bogard from Central Reform Congregation, and just really excited to get to explore really deep questions with all of you. A lot of this growing out of some of the study that we have started together and kind of contemporaneously through the Hartman Institute, but really just growing into more broadly how we look at the world around us and the Jewish world around us. And so today what we've decided that we wanted to talk about, we haven't really delved deeply into denominations. We are here, we've really proud of being a cross-denominational group from the Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox communities, but we haven't really taken the time to talk about what that means for each of us. So we're going to take some time to share personally what it means for us. I'll just say as a word of introduction for me, but this might be true for my colleagues as well, that what I'm going to say is going to be very personal to me, and I'm not claiming to speak on behalf of all Orthodox Jews any more than I can claim to speak on behalf of all Jews, or I can barely even say if I'm going to agree with myself by the end of my paragraph. So, which I think is like the most Jewish thing in the world, right? Like by the end of this, I'll have completely changed my mind. And that's what I love. So for those of you who don't know me, I come from the Orthodox community. I actually identify as modern Orthodox, which I find hilarious. Orthodoxy is the smallest denomination within Judaism, and yet we have subsects of ourselves because that's like, again, how Judaism works. I think in the last studies, Orthodoxy was about 10% of the Jewish population. And particularly, I don't know our number in St. Louis. I know in St. Louis, I think we're largely a Reform community. And so I think some of you know, I come from New York, where there's a much larger Orthodox population. I grew up in the Orthodox community. And for me, I think a big part of my Orthodox identity is a heavy emphasis on text and tradition, right? Like very much like a seeing myself as connected to a strong lineage that, depending on how you want to talk about it, we could say we trace back to Moses at Sinai, certainly going back through the discussion of the rabbis. I'm a really big fan of Talmud and Midrash, right? I just think it's like the ways in which we really grapple with what are these lessons that we're supposed to take from our tradition. But I think for me, it's very much, I think we all hold, I don't want to speak for all of you, but I want to be careful because like I said just before we started that I'm not trying to say this in contrast to anyone, but I often think about sometimes the difference is like, I think all of us as Jews, I think like we all hold some sense of like tradition and a sense of like the modern world around us and how we grapple with it. And I think it's like, we put different weights on the scales, right? Like how much am I going to prioritize modern science? How much am I going to prioritize modern innovation and wisdom and things like that? And how much am I going to prioritize these ancient sources? And so for me, it's, I think there's like somewhat of an equivalency or maybe even like a prioritization of these ancient sources, right? That there's like this deep wisdom that I think is also very heavily informed by modern day world around me, but is really keeps me deeply connected to like where I come from, right? I'm not looking to like veer wildly off track, but to know that I'm following in the footsteps of my own grandparents, great-grandparents, of all the people who came before, even as I know on an intellectual level, that those things are still being constantly innovated because I live in the year 2022. And so for me, I think I'll just say a quick word. I know I'm giving like a very, very broad overview because it's hard to delve deeply into all of this on a, on one foot, but we'll get more into it, I think, in the conversations. But I'll just say like a quick word to say that I also grapple with, like, for as much as I am deeply, deeply in the Orthodox community, I know there's some who don't see me as part of the Orthodox community, particularly being a woman who has stepped into leadership roles. And so there's this kind of tension that I sit with of, like, for me, like, stepping into leadership was one of actually wanting to be more engaged in my Jewish community. Like, I wanted to study more. I wanted to understand more. I wanted to learn the way that my brothers would always be learning, or the ways that others around me would learn. And yet by doing that, like, that inherently made me more progressive or more modern, right? In ways where if I was male would not have made anyone blink an eye, right? I've not really done anything that's all that radical from an Orthodox context, other than just being a woman. And so at the same time, in my journey towards religious leadership, I had many people who said to me, why are you Orthodox? Like, JTS ordains women, HUC ordains women, you can become Reform or conservative and very easily become a rabbi, and you wouldn't have to deal with all of this. And for me, my answer was very much twofold. One was, I'm not Reform and conservative. I'm deeply Orthodox, and I believe that. And also, I believe that Orthodoxy has these spaces. Like, just because historically Orthodoxy has not created this space for women doesn't mean I believe that Orthodoxy doesn't have space for women. And I think that when we leave and jump ship, then all we're doing is kind of giving that space to those voices that say that we don't have that space. So there's a lot more that I could probably go into, but why don't we kind of, I'll start with that. And to also, I'll say actually one final point before I pass it on to, I think I'm passing it on to my Reform colleagues. But I think, we were sort of joking around before we started about who would get started. And I actually didn't want to start because I'll do a much better job responding to these other very wise people. But so the sort of joke was like, we were kind of going almost like in historical order of how our denominations developed. And Orthodoxy is this funny one because we like to think of ourselves as like, there was just Judaism, like people just kind of practice, even as, I don't even think that's totally true. There was rabbinic Judaism. We can get into like Pharisees and Sadducees and Karaites, and right, like there was always factionalism within the Jewish community. But that, at a certain point, rabbinic Judaism wins out. And we sort of have this idea in our minds that there was this kind of like Judaism that existed largely because we weren't allowed to really flourish. We didn't have emancipation. We were living in countries where to be Jewish was to live in a ghetto where others you didn't have freedom to practice. You just were, right? There were Christian countries maybe, right? Jews was what was written on your identity papers. And so you lived in these spaces. There was a chief rabbi who kind of ran things. And so the only way to do things was men leading with a mechitza that separated seating, prayers in Hebrew, right? There wasn't this sense of innovation that we have in the modern era. And so what starts to really happen after emancipation, and my colleagues will talk more about like the development of Reform Judaism, as sort of like people will talk about it veering off of Orthodoxy. But what I find really amusing in all of this is that Orthodox doesn't exist as a denomination until other denominations form, and then Orthodoxy has to kind of name itself and suddenly reclaim this. So I want to name that also of I don't see myself as sort of like, the one that was kind of coming from this line as others branch out. I really see this story as one in which like all of us were part of this Judaism, and then with emancipation and with this shift towards modern vernacular, all of us become branches on this tree. And so I appreciate very much being one branch, but I don't actually think that I'm necessarily even part of the oldest branch on the tree. I think all of us are, and in a way that I think all of us are being innovated even to today. So let me pass it over to.
I don't know who the oldest branch is, but Rabbi Bogard looks like the youngest branch right now. That's for sure. And just to name one more piece here that I think is important, just to add, you talked about emancipation. We should also throw out enlightenment. right? That enlightenment plays a very significant role in all of this. And all those shifts that happen intellectually for people happened in the combination, I think, of first enlightenment and then emancipation, right? In concert with one another. And without those two factors, I think we wouldn't be having this conversation in general. It didn't mean we would all agree and wouldn't mean we're all practicing exactly the same way. But I think those combination of those two things leads to the reality that we're trying to lay out. And again, maybe we live in a hyper emancipated reality now, and so things are shifting again, which makes this, even a hazier kind of conversation. But let's go on. I'm sorry, I just felt that important to add that.
Rory, I have a question for you. If that we're like quizzing each other after these, right? Like that's what we're doing here.
Sure, why not? Yeah.
And I'll speak to my own story a little more later, but I personally always feel much more at home denominationally at Hartman than I ever do in reform spaces. And that's part of what I'm going to talk about. But I guess I'm interested in just hearing from you what home feels like religiously, also being that, you work in a career, in a position where the vast majority of the folks you encounter and work with are liberal Jews, reform and conservative, and just would love to hear some reflection on sort of, it doesn't have to literally be Hartman, but sort of the words in between there.
No, that's a really interesting question. I don't know. I feel at home, I feel at home both in many places and in no places, I think, which maybe is again like a very Jewish story. Look, I think I kind of exist in multiple ways in which I think, like, for me, there's a difference between what it is for me to work in the Jewish world and to like represent the Jewish world and to exist in this wider world as a Jewish person, and what it is for me to practice as a Jew, right? And so like I'm very comfortable, right? Like I can create a Seder for Christians who want to kind of access Judaism, and I know how to translate that, but what I'm going to ultimately give them won't actually look like my family's Seder, right? Because like my family Seder, like I'm actually very at home in like a very insider culture. Part of what I love in the Orthodox spaces I've always grown up in are ones where like you walk in and nobody announces page numbers because everyone just picks up a book. It's not even like everyone's using the same book, but it's that you can hear the prayers and figure out where you are. I remember like being with friends in college where like, I'd be riding on the New York subway and someone would start talking and, like you kind of code switch, and it's, that sort of Judeo, English, Yiddish, and all of that kind of stuff. And so, there's like, it's interesting for me because a lot of my work is making Judaism accessible for others, which sometimes also includes other denominations within Judaism as well, or like creating rituals that are for multiple kinds of Judaisms or multiple kinds of religions. And I love those and I love doing that, but those aren't actually the ways that I would practice. So I don't know if that's really an answer to your question. Like the truth is I am very at home in Orthodox congregations. I'm very at home, like ritually in very strict interpretation, very like halachically Jewish legal structures. Like those are the places that I feel most at home. And yet, like, I don't tend to talk about that as much because I feel like the role that I embody is like a much wider, more inclusive role. But Dana, why don't you use that as a way to transition to your own?
I have more questions. I wanted to know how it changed after you moved from Base Abe to JCRC too.
I mean, like, Base Abe is interesting because like Base Abe also draws like a wide variety of people. So I feel like even as
you were a clergy member at Base Abe, part of the clergy.
That's why I
moved
to St. Louis. No, thank you. I moved to St. Louis to take a pulpit to work with Chaim Schaffner at Base Abe in the pulpit there. And so even then though, like it was also like, so it was very much like an Orthodox context, but it was always like people would come in and, didn't meet, like people weren't always Jewish. Sometimes they were visiting, sometimes they were exploring. I mean, there was always like this, Chaim would talk all the time about like people being on their Jewish journey, right? Like that was the language he loved to use. And so there was always sort of, again, like that balance of kind of like, how do we make this accessible for people? Even while like, for me, there was very much kind of like this grounding. So yeah, like I might've talked more about some of like that kind of like halachic interpretation. But even then, like I didn't assume that everyone in the congregation kept kosher, and I didn't assume that everyone in the congregation, like had the same Shabbat practice that I did. So, but also my background before that had been in interfaith work. I'd always been really, really fascinated by, I think because I grew up in a world where religion was such a huge part of my life, from the food I would eat to like how I would tie my shoes in the morning to like the clothes I would wear, right? Like religion dictated everything. I saw religion as a really powerful force. And so I was fascinated by understanding how religion could be a powerful force for others. So I was really passionate about learning about other faith traditions. And that was what I did before I came to St. Louis. I was still interested in it while I was at Base Abe. And so when I transitioned to the JCRC, that wasn't a very, like, that didn't feel like the stark transition. It was more like going from, like my very, very Orthodox neighborhood in Brooklyn, where the entire grocery store was kosher and like all the food would have been kosher for Passover, long ago, to like moving to St. Louis. That was like the culture shift and the code shift that needed to happen. And once I was in St. Louis, this transition wasn't as big. Okay, now, but you're going to go now, and then we're going to have a conversation. But now I'm passing the baton to you, Daniel.
And actually, Jim or Carney, could I ask one of you to go? There is construction going on right next to me that has gotten very loud all of a sudden.
I'll speak briefly, and hopefully you can.
Even though you're not a reconstructionist, but
yeah, there you go.
Reconstructing now. They changed their names. Yeah,
right.
In process, which does explain the construction going on. It's just
they're just constructing. That's the problem.
So I want to shift the focus of this conversation just a tiny bit, because the whole premise of denominational Judaism I find very disturbing. It's not the approach that I take. I actually believe, and to Daniel, to your question, in theory, I feel comfortable in any expression of Judaism if it is expressed in a way that is respectful and consistent with the values that I was raised with and that I believe in deeply. And I don't want to be contentious, but I take issue with the whole premise that there even are denominations in Judaism, because I don't think there are. And I also don't think that there is such a thing as, new versions of Judaism. To Rory's point that she shared early on, I actually don't think Reform Judaism was an invention of the Enlightenment or post-Enlightenment world or the post-emancipation world, even though the first articulate, systematic descriptions of Reform liberal Judaism appear in a very organized fashion in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. But I believe deeply that there's just Judaism, and there are infinite numbers of expressions of Judaism, which have become expressed in numerous different streams of Judaism throughout Jewish history. And we find evidence, I find evidence, and I think they're hard to argue with, of what later becomes known as liberal Reform Judaism in ancient times. And Daniel, for example, you love to share that beautiful story of the oven of Achnai as an example of a Talmudic text where the rabbis argue with each other and come to very, very different conclusions, and even argue with God. And there are so many times throughout Jewish history when we see what later becomes known as the Reform impulse or the conservative impulse or the modern Orthodox impulse among Jewish thinkers. And I think Reform, conservative, Reconstructionist, Orthodox, modern Orthodox, Hasidic, all the different labels and institutional names we put on different streams of Jewish practice are really much more about two things. They're about institutions and they're about power. And I, as a person who finds most comfort in the particular expressions of Judaism that are articulated by Reform thinkers, to the point both of you made already, I don't find them exclusively there. I find beautiful meaning in people who call themselves Orthodox Jews and what they write and the way they live their lives, people who call themselves conservative Jews and the way they write, think, and live their lives, and those who call themselves non-denominational Jews and thinkers who write about that. And I think that we are stuck and more so now than ever before in Jewish history, we are stuck in the power struggles between the institutions of the Jewish world and what Jews actually believe. And it's long been my contention that if you took all the Jews in the world and put them in a bag and shook them up and then poured them out and redistributed them into similar percentages in different streams of Judaism, it really wouldn't matter. I mean, you might find some fish out of water, some people who were very secular, non-observant Jews who would say, well, I'm not an Orthodox Jew, but they're talking about orthoprax. They're talking about the way they practice and express their Judaism, not what they believe, because I think there are some Jews who believe literally that God spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai and that the words of the Torah were literally God's word as dictated to Moses and conveyed through the centuries to the Jewish people. And there are many Jews who don't literally believe that. And that might be the belief, the doxy of difference between different Jews. But other than that, I know people who call themselves Orthodox, like my cousins growing up, who called themselves Orthodox, modern Orthodox, but they had two sets of dishes, one for kosher food and one for non-kosher food. And when we brought in pepperoni pizza into their house, they ate it on the non-kosher plates. Now, somebody might say, well, then they weren't Orthodox, but they called themselves Orthodox and they identified as Orthodox. And I know people who call themselves Reform, who are very strictly observant of this tradition or that tradition or whatever. So I think we get hung up on this conversation more than we should. And I wonder whether I'm not arguing with our talk today because I think it's fascinating, but I wonder whether the real conversation for the Jewish people today should be, how can we understand each other and respect each other more, but acknowledge Am Yisrael Chai, that we are one people, that we are one Jewish people with an infinite number of different expressions, and we are all free. We should be all free to journey on that path in our own way. So that's my initial, thoughts about this whole conversation about denominations, which I can wax endlessly about Reform Judaism and why I believe in it. But that doesn't mean that I think that that's the right conversation to be having.
Question for you, Jim. So I'm resonating with, struggling with, whatever, reverberating with your notion that the institutions, that the movements themselves in some profound ways don't exist. And I think I agree with much of that, certainly in terms of their relevancy having declined. I guess I still see a thicker line between conservative and Orthodox in a way that, and I'm responding, there was someone who commented on that, Julia, maybe, in the chat, in the way that there used to be, I think, a pretty thick line between Reform and conservative and a thinner line between conservative and Orthodox. My impression is that the boundaries between progressive liberal Jewish denominations, conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, et cetera, in many ways represent one spectrum, but that there is still a pretty thick line when it comes, I wouldn't say orthodoxy on the other side, I would say fundamentalism on the other side, which I think sometimes we mistakenly take to be synonymous with orthodoxy.
Well, there I would agree with you absolutely, and I do believe that there is a line. I don't think it's a thick line, but there is a line between those who choose orthodox belief and practice and the rest of the Jewish world. And I agree. It's funny. I was thinking about growing up. I didn't even really know that there was a significant difference between conservative and Reform Judaism when I was a kid. I was raised in a classical Reform synagogue, but my parents sent me to a conservative synagogue for Hebrew school because my Orthodox Jewish grandparents wanted me to learn Hebrew, and you couldn't study Hebrew in the classical Reform synagogue. And it wasn't until I went away to college, really, that I understood conservative Judaism. And quite frankly, I understood it in a really bad way because I experienced it as an arrogance of people who called themselves conservative Jews who looked down their noses at Reform Jews as somehow inferior. But over the 40 years plus, almost 50 years since then, now what I think is that the boundary, as you said, that thick line between Reform and conservative that maybe once upon a time existed has almost completely disappeared. And there's so little difference between the values and the commitments and the practice of people who call themselves Reform and conservative Jews and all the other liberal Jews that don't cling to a denominational label, that, you know, we are together, and maybe there's a thicker line, as you said, between those, particularly those who are fundamentalists or literalists, I call them, you know, who prescribe to a literalist interpretation of Torah, as opposed to the right of people, the autonomous free choice of people to interpret either institutionally or for themselves, which to me are what the Reform and conservative and Reconstructionist movements or streams are really all about. Maybe we should let Carney jump in and defend the honor of the conservative movement here.
Which of course, it doesn't need to be defended, I think, right? Look, let me say a couple of things. First of all, so much of what you're saying is so very personal to each of you. And we've already made that point, right? That none of us really represent the denominations that we seem to be representing here and now, right? It's fictitious. Those thinner lines, as opposed to the bolder lines that may have existed at a moment in time, or that continue to exist between institutions or movements per se. But I don't want to deny that there are many in our Jewish community to this day, many significant rabbinic leaders, institutional leaders who see those very bold lines. And maybe in part, they want to preserve those very bold lines because there's a utility to the preservation of all of that, right? The coming together or the falling apart mean people don't have jobs, right? People don't have a stake. People don't have a place to put themselves. So I just want to make sure to share all that. And to mention, of course, that Art Green used to talk about all the time the difference between orthodoxy and heterodoxy, right? For a very long time, he's been talking about that. And there really isn't any longer, right? Denominations is just orthodoxy and heterodoxy. And what I think he means by orthodoxy there, Daniel, is much more along the lines of the kind of fundamentalist orientation that you explain. My mother tells me that it actually was Kathy Green who said that. So very good. Everything that Art said, Kathy probably. But it's good to have the source. Thank you. Omer b'shem Omro, right? Omra. So I think it's important. But I want to also say that I still believe that there is some utility. There is some utility in the utilization of the denominational frameworks for certain kinds of orientations. I think otherwise, some of us would not necessarily feel ourselves at home and feel ourselves connected to other like-minded individuals. And I ask myself the question, right? How much energy and time do I spend engaged and involved in the arms of the conservative movement versus my engagement and involvement with Klal Yisrael, right? The multitude or the expanse of the Jewish people. And I just want to show something, since I prepared a little bit for this, maybe just share a little bit of something that I found to be fascinating, which I'm sure each of us can do, right? Just take a look. Tell me when you can see it. Okay. Can you see it? Yeah. So this is conservative Judaism. You see like this cholent up here, right? This stew over here. These are the arms of the conservative movement, right? Now, I bet you we could do the same thing with any of the denominations or any of the movements, right? But on some level, the conservative movement, I think, somehow or another prides itself on being what? A kind of a multiplicity of these elements with very narrow definitions of themselves, with particularist agendas for each of them, which often don't necessarily work in concert with one another. So as opposed, let's say, to an aguda, right, the aguda, or any other movement, or the Reform movement, right, the URJ, this is kind of these elements that are in tension with one another. And on some level, to me, it makes a certain kind of sense, because what ends up happening is if you have Orthodoxy on one side and you have Reform Judaism on the other, the center itself cannot be narrowly defined, because a narrowly defined center means that it really only represents an even smaller number than are in any of these one individual organizations onto themselves, right? Therefore, in representing conservative Judaism here, and this is the kind of stuff that I wanted to share for today, I want to go to the teachings of one of my teachers, Dr. Ismar Shorsh, who was not the last chancellor, but the chancellor before the last chancellor. Dr. Arnie Eisen was the last chancellor, who actually will be speaking here in St. Louis in September. We're looking forward to having him here. He's a great thinker across the denominational spectrum. People him to an interesting speaker. He's doing some fascinating work. But I want to show you what does resonate with me, and if I can find it here. And what it is the 7 core clusters of conservative Judaism as he sees them. And by the way, he gives no priority to these, right? But he says if a person wants to live out sort of the ethos of what we have called conservative Judaism, they have to have these principles in heart and mind and intention with one another, and in not necessarily any order here, right? It's a gestalt, right? It's greater than the sum total of its parts. And so the elements that are here, which may distinguish it in some ways from other branches of Judaism, are the centrality of modern Israel, meaning the modern state of Israel, not modern Israel, but the modern state of Israel. The fact that Ivrit, right, that Hebrew is the irreplaceable language of Jewish expression. And when he means expression here, he doesn't only mean tefillah, right? Doesn't mean only prayer. He means study, and he means actually discourse. By the way, whenever I spoke to the chancellor only spoke to me in Hebrew. Only spoke to me in Hebrew. And I wasn't the only one. When he spoke to students, he spoke to them in Hebrew, right? Devotion to the ideal of Klal Yisrael, which means what? The expanded notion, the notion of a pluralism. Already what we've already said, I think, which we are representing here, the notion that there isn't one kind of Judaism. There isn't Judaism, there's always Judaisms. And that's very important. And it becomes a core cluster or a core principle of conservative Judaism in a way that maybe it doesn't exist in other places. That doesn't mean that there aren't people on this call for whom this is a central principle. But when one talks about a denomination, an expressed set of principles, it doesn't necessarily come up that we see all of these branches as equal, right? And necessary to the great enterprise or project of Judaism. The defining role of Torah in the reshaping of Judaism, isn't it interesting? The defining role of Torah, which is concrete, in the reshaping, that it's a Torah that's tamid mechudash, always being renewed. And it's not only the shaping, but the reshaping of Judaism for every era. The ongoing study of Torah, Talmud Torah, right? We heard from Maharat Rory about the importance of text, but one cannot be engaged and involved in an ever-evolving religious civilization, right? To use a kind of a more reconstructionist concept, right? The notion of a Judaism that's always in formation, and the governance of Jewish life by halakha. That halakha has a place, right? It is the governance of Jewish life, that the default goes there first, right? And then if we deviate from it, that's the starting point, right? We often change governance. We're doing it in our synagogues right now, right? I don't know how many of us have rewritten our bylaws, reimagining what our institution is going to look like. What is the role of the lay person? What's the role of the professional? What is the lay professional relationship? These are happening throughout the world in many not-for-profit organizations and institutions. I can imagine that all of us have had those kind of bylaws revisions conversations that are going on. But the governance itself comes from a place of indicating that halakha has a way in which to govern, at least help the process in governing. And finally, it's emunah, right? A belief in God. Whatever you mean by God, that becomes a central principle. And I would say that, again, since we're doing this on a personal level, these clusters together, right, make me resonate most with this kind of orientation to Judaism, right? Conservative, Masorti, whatever we're going to call it. By the way, years ago, if you remember, there was this whole conversation about changing the name of the conservative movement, right? And so, at the time, people wanted to say Masorti, which is the Hebrew word for sort of tradition, right? And other people wanted to go with, I don't know, whatever it's communal Judaism, covenantal Judaism. I always wanted to go with confusative Judaism. Why? Because the truth of the matter is to hold these core clusters in heart and mind simultaneously is a hard thing to do. It's a very hard thing to do. It demands a certain level of sophistication, nuance, and knowledge. And I think that's a very key part. And I'm not saying that's unique to the conservative movement. I think it's probably the reality of all of our rabbinates that have to come from a genuine place of knowledge. But I think for me, this is why it resonates. Now, does that mean that the only Judaism I appreciate is conservative Judaism? Absolutely not. I would just say the following. Our teacher, Rabbi Greenberg, used to say, the best thing you can have is sacred envy. Sacred envy. I'm so jealous in a positive way of the profound work that's been done in what we would call the other denominations or other expressions of Judaism. And I want to learn from those, right? I have a semi-permeable membrane to let those ideas in. And they, of course, have made their way in, particularly, and as I said in a post, a kind of a post-modernity that we're living in, where all the structures are falling apart. Pieces are flowing in and pieces are flowing out. right? And I think that's fascinating to watch. And I think the Judaism that we're going to evolve will probably be some kind of chont of all of these kinds of Judaisms. But I think for many of us, at least, these moorings still are instructive, helpful, and at least allow us to locate ourselves to begin a conversation about how we can grow.
Carney, I just want to jump in really quickly, though, and
Yeah.
say thank you for sharing that. And it was beautiful, as your words are always beautiful. As I was looking at those, that sacred cluster of all those values, I wanted to just share publicly that every single one of those shared values exists almost word for word in the most recent effort by the reform movement, which is a challenge in and of itself, but in the most recent principles of Reform Judaism, or the closest thing we have to a platform of Reform Judaism in a movement that is really defies shared platforms any longer. But every one of them exists there in almost word for word fashion, with one exception, and it is the guiding nature of halakha in our lives. And so I just wanted to make a point that to reinforce my point, of course, because
That's your job.
I got to prove that I'm right. No, but my contention that we share so much more, which I heard from you as well, than we differ on. Really the only institutional substantial, look, there are institutional differences on many of these. You could argue that maybe conservative Jews value Hebrew more than Reform Jews in general, but not by most of the leadership. We value the Hebrew language. You could argue that there are different commitments to Zionism in Israel, perhaps in the conservative movement, but the only real tangible difference institutionally between our movements today really revolves around halakha and its role, and all the areas where we differ. The difference between, for example, what your members are told they should and shouldn't eat, and what our members are told they should and shouldn't eat, or what they are told they should or shouldn't do, or who they should or shouldn't marry. Those are all a difference revolving around the role of halakha, of Jewish law, in our lives. And to me, that's the operative dividing line still between all the movements of Judaism. The way you treat halakha and the way we treat halakha, and the way you and I treat halakha, in contrast to the way people who call themselves Orthodox treat halakha. I don't know whether you all agree, but that's the way I read that.
I think it's an interesting point. Let me throw out one thing though, okay? And maybe part of it is how we define halakha, right? As you said, and I would say the following, and maybe this is where there may be a difference between some of us on this call. I'd particularly be interested, since we're kind of representing the liberal denominations, to hear from the Maharat. But from my perspective, halakha is not law. Halakha is the way we decide together what the path we're going to take in order to bring ourselves closer to one another and closer to the divine. That's how I define the path, right? The halicha of halakha, right? How one walks the walk. Now, these are the wonderful suggestions that those who've come before us have put into place and formulated over the course of time and canonized in many ways, unfortunately, right, into codes of Jewish law, which I appreciate and have studied and love and continue to appreciate the opportunity to study those things, right? But what I'm always looking for is how that leads us to what it is that we're going to do in this particular iteration of a pathway towards one another and a pathway towards God. And so that is really an evolving reality. And so there'll be moments in time where we're going to have to make significant shifts and changes. And maybe, Jim, the real part is a piece of all this is maybe we're not so really far apart when it comes to that, right? What is the utility? What is the role? What is the function of halakha? And it's okay with me if those divisions and those differences, and that line, as Daniel described, as opposed to a thick line, are getting thinner and thinner and thinner, and that's okay to the point where they're somewhat porous. I got to tell you, particularly since you mentioned Hartman, Rory, and others who mentioned, and Daniel, it was so interesting to me to be at Hartman, to sit with Orthodox Jews and conservative Jews and Reform Jews and Reconstructionist Jews, and to watch people's practice. And you would have thought that the Reform rabbi was actually an Orthodox rabbi, and the Orthodox rabbi's liberal ideas, I don't know what practice really meant, because one of the things we never tried to do was daven together, right? We never tried to pray together, because that would have stepped into a realm where there would have been some discomfort for some people. I will just say one thing, maybe I'm outing us, but at Hartman, there was one time when we did daven together. Somebody in our group had a death, right? And they wanted to say Kaddish with their classmates, right? And so we davened mincha together, led by a woman who herself was the Avel, was the mourner, and the Orthodox rabbis did not, and Maharats in the group, did not walk out, but rather davened with us and answered Amen and Yehi Shmei Rabbah and responded to the davening. And I want to say that was one of the proudest moments where I really felt the notion of Klal Yisrael, of the expanse of the Jewish people. So I said a lot, but I was sort of, somebody was bothering in the chat, you're not talking, so I think I did my job.
So, I really appreciate this, and I'm trying to give voice to some of the tension that I feel in this conversation from where I sit. I don't think you guys are in tension with each other. I think, right, but like some of the tension that this is raising for me, in the sense that I'm very comfortable with this whole conversation, and it's easy for me. It's easy for me to appreciate all that you're all saying for who you are, and in caring about all of you and loving all of you, in just like getting to know all of you and knowing that experience. And I think also, Carney, to the story you just shared, like I've been in similar situations before, and in the same way, where I would stay in the room and I would respond and all of that, and that's easy for me in many ways, because those are situations where no one's actually asking me. Like no one's even asking me my opinion, right? Let alone, right? Like this group has decided, right? This person who is leading has decided. I don't know the person, right? So I'm just gonna, right? But from what you said, right? So this person has decided that she has the minyan that she needs to be able to pray. She is an avel. This is the ritual that she needs. And so, like in relationship, we want to honor that person, and so we'll stay in community for that, right? Which is a very different situation than. If it was right, like how would we react differently? Like if it was one of the Orthodox rabbis who was an avel and wanted to be able to say Kaddish, but didn't recognize the women in the minyan, right? Like that. First of all, right? It's like everyone sort of like loves when the Orthodox people kind of like participate in the liberal, but not when then they say, "Here's what I need to be able to practice in the way that I want." And I find, like, I mean, Daniel, you were sort of pushing me on some of the questions earlier, but like, it's one of the things that's actually easiest about my job now, right? Like my job is to work with the Jewish community. My job is not to make decisions about who's Jewish. If you say you're Jewish and you come into the building and you participate in the community, then it's my job to work with you, right? It doesn't matter. Like no one's asking me. So there could be people who come across who from my interpretation of halakha would not be considered Jewish, whether because of the family they were born into, the conversion, right? Whatever it is, right? That like, it's not my bit, right? Julia, you were sharing earlier in the chat, like there's people who have said, right, like these Judaisms or you don't count or whatever. I would never say that to someone, right? Because it's not my business. But it's a very different situation when right, like where I feel the tension is that I want to lean really deeply into this Ahavat Yisrael and into this Am Yisrael Chai and into this Klal Yisrael. Like I want to really lean into this, like we're all Jews, and I can do that professionally in part because I don't actually work within a denomination, and I can kind of like absent myself from it, right? And what becomes really painful is that it's easy to sort of talk about these things separately, but that when suddenly, and I don't know like how it is for you, right? But like and again, right, I want to be careful with my words, right? But it's like, I love, like, Jim, what you're doing in your congregation, right? And I totally support it. But if one of your congregants then wants me to perform a wedding for them or something, right? Like there's times where like those conversations become super complicated. And that's the part that I feel like we need to talk about, that tension. It's great when we all stay in our lanes, but the truth is we don't, like, we can see everyone as Jews, but there's shifting lanes gets really complicated.
Can I ask you a question, Rory?
Yeah.
I want to ask a question. I want to go back to something you said, the previous thing. How and I asked this question in genuine sincerity, but I'm curious how you feel about a person who considers himself an Orthodox Jew, who says, I just can't or won't step into a Reform or conservative synagogue during their worship, not because of Shabbat, because obviously that's a different issue, because can't ask somebody, but I can't come into a Reform synagogue. I once experienced this, by the way, where we held, when Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated, we held a communal service, and the Orthodox, and it was in my synagogue in North Carolina, and a couple of the high-ranking Orthodox leaders in the community refused to attend. One of them came and stood in the doorway of our sanctuary, but not in the sanctuary. And I'm just curious to know how you feel about that, whether it's out of, I should respect that as a liberal Jew and say, I understand, or is there something amiss there?
Both. No, right. So look, Rav Moshe Feinstein, I mean, the leading Orthodox halachic authority of the 20th century in New York, wrote a tshuva. He has a responsa that said that Jews should not go into Reform and conservative congregations, right? Like there is a legal ruling. And so my guess, without knowing all of the people, is that those individuals, and particularly, I think it's actually interesting in your story that you have someone who stood in the doorway, who I actually think that probably, again, without knowing this person, might have been his way of wanting to participate, but feeling like he wasn't allowed to, as opposed to, totally being absent, like he wanted, right? And so I grapple with, on the one hand, I understand fully why that's offensive, right? I don't blame anybody, any of you, right? I don't blame you for being offended in that context. And how do we also recognize that, like, to respect all Jews is to also respect that Orthodox Jews are going to have a different way to practice? Right?
I think though, Rory, I think one of the pieces, again, it's St. Louis, so it's a little different because my experience elsewhere was it was the frommest common denominator, the most religious common denominator that won the day, whether that is tefillah, prayer, whether that is kashrut, right? Whether there's a whole host of things that work in the other direction. And so it's interesting, right? Because you raised the issue of, would it have worked the other way if an Orthodox person wanted to have a minyan? The answer is that everybody in the liberal community understood that the Orthodox person needed a minyan of 10 men. It doesn't go without saying, because the notion of pluralism was a notion that they understood, that you have a certain way in which you daven, which you want to honor. The only time I actually really understood this in a different kind of way was when I went to Deal, New Jersey, and they found out that I wasn't Syrian. Now, I was wearing a white on white talit, which is the talit that Syrian Jews wear. And I received the Chamishi Aliyah to the Torah. They thought I was Syrian because of my dark complexion. And I was there with some friends who were Syrian. And they went back after I had the Aliyah. You want to hear this? And they reread the Torah portion because they found that I wasn't Syrian. Okay. Now, again, this is the exact opposite of the notions that we're trying to promulgate here. And I'm almost embarrassed to tell this story, but whenever there has been in a reality when a person at Hartman had a loss or needed to say Kaddish and it was an Orthodox person, nobody asked the women, nobody had to ask the women in the room to step out so that that person had a space that was sacred for them. Or appropriate for them, or halachically what they needed. There was sort of an understanding that was necessary. And what I would like to see, and as we think about the era of the Messiah, right, this perfect era, is that we will be able to honor one another and stay in each other's spaces, step into the sanctuary, to use your example, right? But so step into the sanctuary, pray before you get there. I think my mom put that, upka daven, go daven before you come, right? What is going to happen to you other than maybe the Holy One of Blessing will look down and say, you honored my other creations who are in this space? And I think that's something we could potentially be talking about as we move forward, as practically one of the places we could find a way in which to find common ground. Maybe it won't be my halachic obligation that's fulfilled, but I can stay in this space and watch others facilitate for themselves a meaningful experience. And I can enjoy the moment. I was in Jim Shul the other night for this wonderful Friday night davening. And it was beautiful. First of all, just like aesthetically, it was beautiful. And the outpouring of love from people for Rabbi Stiffman, who was, having a second bar mitzvah, it was just so wonderful. Now, was the style of davening my preferred style of davening? No, I missed things. On the other hand, there were so many things that were beautiful and a few things that I decided to steal. to bring into my experience, which I think is the greatest example of learning from one another. Had I not been there, I never would have seen and never would have experienced and wouldn't have a better way, I think, or another way in which to serve the Holy One of Blessing. So I just wanted to add that in there, and Rory, maybe you have a comment in reaction.
Yeah, no, I think I don't disagree with you. I wholeheartedly agree with you on a personal level, Carney. Like I personally agree with you. I have joined Jim's congregation for both Friday night and Shabbat morning davening. I don't think I've been at either of the rest of you, but you haven't invited me, so that's really on you guys. Daniel's like, I don't want you there. So right, like yes, but like I do need to also push back, because I think we have to also realize, like, in this view of this beautiful pluralistic, thanks Leslie, right, this beautiful pluralistic society inherently assumes a pluralism, right? And so part of the question is do we only have a Jewish community? Like if we're going to talk about this wonderful all-encompassing Jewish community that I think many of us here do work for in a variety of ways, then we have to also recognize that part of the people within the community are the people who don't want to live in that community. And I want, like, that's why I'm saying I think we need to sit with that tension. I think there's ways that people don't have to do it in an offensive fashion, but I think, right, that would be, look, it's like saying, I don't think this is what you're saying, but I'm just saying, right, like if somebody, right, if someone were to invite me to their home and they were serving food that I don't, right, that's not kosher, right, food that they would consider not kosher. I don't even mean, like, let's not even say it's a debate, right? If somebody says, right, like they've created, you know, they're, I don't know, it's a bacon cheeseburger or whatever, right? Like, and they serve it, I'm not going to eat it just to be polite, right? Like there's a point where, like, right, and so there, in a way, I feel like part of what we're saying is like, no, but like we have to be nice. You can be nice and still very respectfully say, thank you very much for making this food, but this is not food that I'm able to eat.
But Rory, a cheeseburger and entering somebody's sanctuary to honor Rabin are two different categories, right?
They are, but what I'm saying that is that for some of these people, it's not. I'm saying that like, again, I'm not dismissing what Jim shared. I hope I'm being really clear about that. I understand what it is to feel offended. I also know what it is to have people who, you know, aren't comfortable when I speak from the pulpit. Like I understand the feeling, and I'm not at all trying to be dismissive. I'm trying to give voice, though, to some of the voices that are not in this conversation to say that they believe that if there's a rabbi who said that they're not allowed to enter the sanctuary, then you're saying, like, we'll just be polite. Like that's like saying we'll just eat the food. They're saying that they don't think they're allowed to do it.
It actually, I understand and I actually appreciate and respect what you just said. I think it is part of the complexity. It also reminds me, and I just want to expand this conversation a little tiny bit. This is one of the biggest challenges we face in this day, which is the tendency of people, whether it's religious comfort or whether it's ideological or political comfort, to surround ourselves only with those people with whom we feel comfortable. The tendency, for example, of us all to live in the echo chambers of our own reality, whether it's, you know, the Fox News or the CNN, MSNBC echo chamber, or whether it's the echo chamber of Republican or Democrat ways of looking at the world, or whether it's the echo chamber of my Zionism versus your Zionism or your non-Zionism. All of these things are things that divide us. And Rory, I don't want to minimize what you just said because I respect it deeply. It's a dilemma. But when we allow ourselves to forget our core values, our most important value, which, you know, is this love for all human beings and this compassion and this, you know, all these values that Jews of whatever denomination you have all claim to be their core values, but they set them aside because my rabbi told me that I can't, in this case, I can't do it. And by the way, we Jews collectively do this about other faiths too. How many times have we all heard people say, I would never step foot in a Catholic church, or God forbid, you know, my grandfather used to tell stories of how his grandfather would literally take his hand and they would cross the street when they were walking down the sidewalk if they were too close to a church. So it's not, we shouldn't only castigate our Orthodox fellow Jews for choosing to follow whatever they're taught or believe. I think it's a human tendency that we're struggling with mightily in this world today.
Nor should we castigate those who prioritize differently than we do, right? If pluralism is a greater value than, let's say, halakha, just for a moment, okay? Or that is our halakha. That's the way we do our halicha, right? How we walk in the world. It's to prioritize the notion of other people's comfort, even in our spaces, which are particularistic, but to say that our particularistic institutions are going to be universalistic in their openness to others, that may be a prioritization. How we prioritize may be actually much more consequential than our denominations or any of the ideological dogmatic statements that we're going to make here, or even the practical statements, right? I want to respect everybody, but I also want to say there are uber categories. And I wonder, as we move further and further into a post-modernity, right, a post-postmodernity, will this notion of a pluralism be one of the radical foundations of a Judaism that has to become ever more or la goyim, right? Light unto the nations of the world, of universal principles that we all have to live by. Otherwise, the concept of being in our own echo chambers and listening to the news that we want to hear and talking to the people that agree with us, right, are only going to hear or read books that agree with the things that we think and want to hear. That isn't growth. That is stultifying. That is the opposite of growth. It takes us backwards. Daniel's construction is done at his place. So now we're going to hammer on him for a while.
I also just want to throw in, thanks, Carney. It strikes me actually that this conversation we just had, I think, is the clearest illustration of the denominational lines between us that we've seen. And I just want to sort of go meta on that for a moment. That, right, like Carney, you and Jim were talking about universal values, and Rory was sitting there going, but halakha. Right? Like, but for this person who's Orthodox, right? Like the double bacon cheeseburger and walking into that sanctuary may be religiously equivalents. I want to be clear. I'm someone who does not believe we have a moral obligation to tolerate intolerance. But I think it's worth backing up and looking at the way this has been illustrated there, those lines between us. I know we're running out of time, so I will jump in with sort of my story here and my relationship to denominations. I have never felt connected to any denomination in any meaningful way. I showed up at HUC, the Rabbinical School of the Reform Movement, which was the only rabbinical school I looked at, though I think that's only because that's where Susan told me to go, so that's where I went. I showed up and I remember being at like the opening thing and someone mentions the URJ and I said, what's the URJ? And they looked at me and they said, oh, that's the new name for the UAHC. And I said, oh, what's the UAHC? Right. I have never felt deeply connected to the movement. I think a big part of that is that I grew up at CRC, which, though it is nominally a Reform congregation, right, and belongs to the movement, I think actually in a profound sense, CRC has always been a post-denominational place more than it has been a movement place. We never have used the sidurs of the Reform movement. We've never used the Israel trips. We've never been super, other than a few exceptions, involved in the youth movements or the camps or the, which is to say that I think I'm an anti-institutionalist as much as I feel connected to any institution, which is how I ended up working at a conservative shul. That felt like a very porous boundary to me. And I was already living my life in a way that was consistent with what conservative rabbis are expected to observe in terms of kashrut, in terms of Shabbat, and so on and so forth. And I showed up at that conservative shul and had an out of tribe experience that really surprised me because I had given so many talks and whatever about how there's no real boundary between these things. It's porous, et cetera, et cetera. And I actually think it might be for individual congregants. But as a rabbi, particularly after the 2016 election, I will say that really reinforced it. But I had this sense that I was serving a community that was not quite my tribe and was not quite my home. Not that the Reform movement necessarily is, and I'm not sure that there is a movement there anymore, right? The diversity of what it would mean to show up, Jim, at your shul and at our shul and at United Hebrew on a Friday night is right. Like, I bet that's a bigger spectrum of difference than the difference between, B'nai Emunah and Beis Abe, or even maybe B'nai Emunah and sometimes our congregation, right? And so I guess that's where I sit, is that I have come back home to CRC, both literally and metaphorically, in terms of post-denominational, anti-denominational, anti-institution. I don't know what the words are here, right? Rory sometimes jokes when we're lobbying that I'm the one to bring in to blow things up. Yeah, I will say, I think the other piece that is connected to this is I grew up, when I think about the two poles of my Jewish identity in early childhood, it's CRC and it's remote Emunah, B'nai Emunah's camp. And I grew up always having this sense of not being at home in either of those places, or a home living between those spaces. That was the wrong way of saying it. I actually often felt at home in both of those spaces is a better way of saying it. And when I look back at my career, or what it has been so far, I see the ways that it has been in tension with those two poles, and my relationship has been in tension with those. So all of which, to sum up, is to say that I actually think the denominations continue to be important and significant for the elites of these movements, the rabbis, the leaders, the so on and so forth, in ways that they're not for the vast majority of the people who interact with these various institutions. I guess maybe the very last thing I'll say here is I also think our national institutions, truthfully, in many ways, have become cartels more than anything else that exist to hold up and prop up a status quo and institutional models that don't necessarily serve the Jewish people the best way that they could. I'm thinking of the ways that, like, you can't use the reform movement's placement system, even if you're a member of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, if you didn't go to HUC unless you wait for a 5-year penalty period. Like, I don't understand how that serves anyone but institutional interests. And truthfully, I think a lot of these institutions exist to continue serving these interests and serving these models, and serving models where rabbis get paid relatively well, and serving,
but Daniel, I don't think you would say it's always conscious nor malicious. I want to
no, absolutely
right.
not.
Sometimes there's
not.
a consciousness, and sometimes I think they really believe in their hearts that what they're doing is perpetuating something that's very consequential and significant.
Absolutely.
And I will say, and I don't know of anybody else's experience here, but there have been times that having a denominational organization to turn to, maybe when we're in transition, maybe when we're in crisis, maybe when we need counsel and guidance, right? Sometimes those individuals have been really consequential and significant as humans who have been through the wars enough times to know this is something that's really important. So, once upon a time, and I still do, have a father who once said, sometimes they leave those people at the institutions because they don't want the rest of the world to encounter those individuals, okay? That's sort of the jaded perspective. The other perspective, sometimes these people have tremendous talent and gifts, and whether they're placement people, whether they're pension people, whether they're health insurance people, like those things exist because there are systems. And so I just want to appreciate those individuals as well. Now, is there a certain myopia? Maybe. Is there an overemphasis on denominations or the flag, waving of the particular denomination or institution? It does happen. And I would say that we're not necessarily exempt from that as well. There are moments when we stand in front of our congregations and we talk about the triumphalism of our particular institution, because and I don't say triumphalism in a bad way. You could not do the things that you are doing, which are amazingly important, right, Daniel, Jim, Rory, without the backing or the backbone of the institutions that you have. We get pulpits, we get opportunities, we get doors open for us because we are the leaders of. And that is something that comes in part by the power invested in us by the institutions and organizations that did for us, and those who came before us. Now, what the next iteration is going to look like, I don't know. I really don't know. I think Hebrew College is banking on the fact that what will really survive into the future, and AJR and other places, which, by the way, those schools are growing, right? The standard denominational schools are not growing, even within Orthodoxy, right? The growth and the power now of YCT, right, versus what it once upon a time was. I mean, it's amazing to me to see the growth, and the people that I'm interacting in the most creative settings in America today, or in the world today, are coming from places like Chovevei. That's an offshoot. That's a creative element, and I see that happening in lots of different places. So I don't think anybody would disagree. I just think there's something that's happening in the world that's at large, that somehow or another we're going to have to find some way in which to understand, to wrap our arms around all of this, and to look for our training. And I don't know about the rest of you, but when we talk here, the four of us went to an institution that was run by a guy who was absolutely an Orthodox rabbi and said so. We went to Hartman, and we knew what Rabbi Hartman was going to talk about, right? And both Rabbi Hartmans, okay? As much as Daniel may be different than his father, right? And in lots of different ways, they're still Orthodox folks and see themselves in that way. But we all went there, and we all were impacted in profound ways, leading to this conversation as well. And they deserve many, 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 many kudos for the ability to allow us to have these ongoing conversations that we will continue to have, Bezrat Hashem, for many years to come.
I appreciate that very much. And I think that's really beautifully said. And I think, honestly, I think part of it is just these conversations. I mean, I don't think that because really, that's the beauty of living in a place where we all do get to choose our Judaism, is that even if we all did have really firm lines and wanted to stay in our own corners, individuals are still going to choose their own path, right? Like the innovation is not just coming, because of leaders innovating, but because the community is insisting on innovation, right? The community is responding to it. Look, this was when I was in Yeshivat Maharat, the big question was, will we get jobs, right? Like, okay, so people are going to train us and they're going to ordain us, but if no one hires us, then it's all meaningless, right? So like AJR, Hebrew College, right? Like you can have these institutions that can innovate, but if the community wasn't supporting it, then it would all disappear. So what we're seeing really, I mean, is that all of this is part of the community. And I think part of what's so powerful is that we get to really wrestle with these questions. And so I love that yes to everything that you're saying. And for me, like, it's very much like, how do we continue to lean into these tensions? Because I think that there are real opportunities that are going to emerge, and there's also real questions. I think that I think we're also going to see some of the lines with Orthodoxy continue to grow, because I think in ways where, a few generations ago, you had very strict ideological difference between denominations, but still a recognition of a Jewish community in some fashion, right? Or a recognition of, like, who was a Jew, in ways that I think the Orthodox community is becoming really uncomfortable with. Like, how many generations back do we go? At what point? I mourn the question of, like, at what point do we start actually having, like, conversions between denominations because the denominations don't recognize?
Rory, no, I was thinking exactly the same thing, and I just want to, like, shine a different angle on that light. I think there will always be groups of people within each of the denominations who will self-isolate themselves to protect what they believe and their core values. But I think what we're feeling are the birth pangs of something different, which is a larger center, where there are many people who are willing to challenge that. And even within the Orthodox world, I think you're right. I think we are headed that way, where there will be firmer lines, but there will be more people stepping over those lines, in part because of necessity. When somebody who is on one side of the lines, child or grandchild, marries somebody who is not on the other side of the line, who's on the other side of the line, they may actually say, you know what, I'm not going to be Tevye and Fiddler on the roof, and walk away. And similarly, on the other end of the spectrum, I mean, I can't tell you how many Reformed Jews that I knew over my career who said, I wouldn't go to Chabad, I wouldn't step foot in there. And still in our community, I'll bet you if you polled the members of our synagogues, many of them have never been inside one of the Orthodox shuls in town, and don't have any interest. But I think there's more and more opportunities because of things like the Hartman Institute, because of generations of people who've been trained the way we have to look for opportunities for genuine pluralism, for us to role model and to say to people, don't be afraid. I mean, we just saw an example of that. I don't know how widespread the participation was, but the Clean Speech St. Louis initiative that emanated out of Aish Torah, 25 years ago, if you said the word Esha Torah in the presence of a Reformed Jew, they would have shuddered and run the other way because of fear of they're our enemy, or the same you could say of Chabad. But today people are saying, let's listen to what we have to share with each other. And I think the center is actually getting bigger. And there's another center, which is the disaffiliated, unaffiliated, disinterested, that is also getting bigger, which reminds us of how important it is for us to find these lines of commonality. And I'm just so grateful for the opportunity to speak with people like you. And, I would love, by the way, I know we talk about this a lot, but I think it's a time for us to reconsider. We need to find other voices that are even different from ours to come join this conversation.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because we are our own echo chamber, unfortunately.
Right. But I do want to just give us one prop, okay? And that prop is, and you talked, Jim, beautifully about the center, right? There's something called the courageous center, right? We are the courageous center. You see, somebody has to be willing to come into this conversation, not to tell us where we're wrong, but to add their voice to help us learn more and grow more and expand the core, that center core. And it's got to be a courageous center. We have to be willing to step outside of our comfort zones, right? Our echo chambers, etc., whatever kind of terminology you want to use. And so I'm all in favor of that. But the ground rules have to be that you're not coming into this environment to tell us how to do it better. That's the part of all of this that, and you can make suggestions for how to make it better. That for sure. I want to hear that. But what I don't want to hear is you're wrong, right? And there are going to be moments where we're going to feel that way. We're going to say, I don't resonate with that. It's just like we talk about a clean speech, right? The way in which we utilize language. There is so much that happens in this conversation that is, I hear you, I appreciate that, and not even but, and, right? We use that language. And that's something that I think we've cultivated and learned over the course of time. And when we disagree with one another, we do it with love and concern, not because we want to be right, but rather because we are leaders in our own rights, in our own communities, and our community as a whole. And we may have something that could add to the totality that will enhance all the, right? The ships will all rise, right? Because of this rising tide. So I'm with you 100%. Let's invite people in. But our ground rules also have to be ground rules. And that's what a courageous center says. You can come into our space, into this space of people who want to hear each other, but not to castigate, not to in some way dismiss, not in some way to make fun of. And I think that's unfortunately what's happened in a lot of the settings that we find ourselves in. Who wants to go there anymore? Who wants to go to a conversation when someone's going to stand up and wag their finger at you? That isn't the way in which we should be conducting ourselves, particularly in and around this time of Pesach. Just to finish, right? Where we're so interested in bringing people to the table, right? That fifth child that doesn't make it. By the way, a Lubavitch notion, right? A Chabad notion of the fifth child that has to be brought into this experience as well.
So again, Carney, I don't know. Today I'm like pushing back. Yes, but both of it. On a practical level, yes. Like we're gonna have a conversation. We've been chatting about bringing in some other voices and how we can expand this. And I think partially like now that we've established a really firm foundation, because that's the other thing though. This is also it's not just about laying the ground rules. Like we've already created norms because we've done this. So anyone else who's coming in is the new kid on the block. But what I just think we need to sit with the tension. Like it might be that the person who comes in is we're going to lay those ground rules because you're right. I don't necessarily want to be in a conversation where we're being castigated. But if my vision of the Jewish community is a vision that actually holds the whole Jewish community, then I have to somehow still include in my mind whether or not I need to I don't necessarily need to subject myself, right? The same way, I don't necessarily need to be in the conversation with the person who wants to tell me all the ways I'm not Orthodox, but I know they exist and I know that they have they're still just as Jewish, right? Like they have a view within Judaism and I don't get to throw them out of it either. So all I want to challenge us to do as we close out is that I think we've really presented this really beautiful view of how we hold this multitude, but I want to just challenge all of us that even who joins the conversation is going to be a self-selecting group of who's going to come to this table, right? And if we really want to be the people who can hold a bigger Judaism, then somehow in my space, whether or not they're in my conversation, in my headspace, it needs to include the people who don't want pluralism, and the people who don't want to talk to us, and the people who want to tell us why we're wrong, right? Like they are
Respectfully,
also,
though. So that's the point. Respectfully.
even, but my point is even not. I'm not saying that they get to castigate us. But what I'm saying is that
This is
there
where
are
we're going to
people-
disagree.
My point is, and we're gonna have to close out. But my point is that those people are also part of our community. I don't think it's fair to say, oh, I own, right? Because then otherwise we're doing exactly what Jim said, which is we're just being our own echo chamber, right? So if this is really about, right, if we're celebrating Pesach and the holiday when we become this full nation, then let's just remember that includes the people that we don't always like every day, right? It includes the people who aren't going to follow our rules, all of the
Absolutely.
rules, your rules, my rules, all of them. So
Pesach,
the-
right? B'ne'areinu v'zkeneinu nelech, right? We're going to go with our young and our old, with our male children, our female children, right? Our old people, young people. Ki chag Hashem lanu, right? It's a holiday for our God and for us. And so I want to wish everybody Chag Kasher Sameach. And we march forward with all of them, even the people that I don't agree with and I don't like. But I think at some point I'd love to continue the conversation with you about what do you do, right? It's in many ways it's the Rasha, right? It's the evil child of what do you do with a person of that sort, right? At what point are you wanting to?
Chag Sameach.
Yeah,
Chag
there you go. There he is,
Chag
the missing child. But what do we do with that? What do we do with that tension? I can countenance as a person. The question is, can they countenance me? That's the problem, right? And I want to believe that there are people who disagree strongly with me all the time, and do it in such a way that it's for my growth or for the growth of the conversation or for the betterment of the world at large. And if that's the case, come to the table with that kind of conversation. I'm more than happy to engage
So
in that.
look, let's continue the conversation because I know we're at time, and I don't think there's easy answers for all of it. I'm saying though is that I can't erase those people either any more than I want these people to erase me, right? Like if they don't get to say that I don't get to seat at the table or I'm not really right. So people are putting in the chat, right? Like, are those people going to accept as pluralists, whatever, right? So we have to realize that our community is messy and it includes the people who don't like the other people. And I want to be the people who likes all people, but some people don't like me.
Right.
So
the canceling of people is an issue, but I would ask the question to think, and maybe this is for me at least the last word today. Does a person at some point in time lose their opportunity to have a platform in a dialogue when they espouse ideas and espouse them in ways that are beyond the pale? Does a person become, a persona non grata in that environment? And the question is, when does that happen and how does that happen? And I hope it doesn't happen, but I unfortunately have seen it happen or feel it should happen.
I want to clarify. I think you're confusing though. I'm not saying that those people get a platform and I'm not saying that they have to come to this session. I agreed with you. I said, we can lay ground rules. This is our space. We get to decide who we invite in. All I'm saying though, is that any definition of our Jewish community has to still remember that those people
Amen.
exist as part of our Jewish community. I don't mean everyone needs their own platform for it, but I can't create a definition of Judaism that doesn't still include those people because they're Jewish.
I'm with you. Nitzchuni v'anai nitzchuni. Great. That's great. That's wonderful. Chag Kasher v'sameach, everybody. Thanks, everybody. Great being with you. Enjoy.
Until the other side.
Amen. Amen.